Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you compelling tales of resilience, betrayal, and triumph. In today's story, we follow Lauren, a successful professional whose life is turned upside down when her husband and his family betray her in the most calculated way. What begins as a devastating loss becomes a journey of uncovering lies, exposing corruption, and reclaiming her power. This is a story about justice, strength, and finding the courage to rebuild from the ashes. Subscribe to Life Stories now, and let's dive into today's gripping tale. You won't want to miss this. The conference room felt suffocating, like a coffin sealed shut. The sleek mahogany walls reflected the harsh glow of two fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. 6 pairs of eyes stared at me with a rehearsed sympathy that somehow made the moment even worse. I tried to ignore the knot in my stomach, but it had been there since morning. Ever since I received the call from Human Resources asking me to bring my laptop and security badge to the 4th floor. That's when I should have known something was wrong. Lauren, you've been an invaluable asset to Preston and Clark. Director Stevens began, his hands folded neatly on the polished table in front of him. His voice was steady, almost practiced. But due to budget constraints, the rest of his words dissolved into white noise. Budget constraints. After 10 years of 60-hour weeks, missed holidays, and endless sacrifices, this was my reward. My mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. I thought about the nights I'd stayed late, the weekends I'd given up to ensure deadlines were met, the promotions I'd fought tooth and nail for. All of it now reduced to corporate jargon and empty platitudes. My fingers dug into the leather armrest of the chair as I struggled to maintain composure. My instinct was to shout, to demand answers. But I knew better. I'd spent years perfecting the art of restraint in corporate America, always professional, always polished, never showing weakness. It was the same discipline that had helped me climb the ladder. And now, it felt like that very restraint was being used to shove me off the edge. Of course, we'll provide a generous severance package, Stevens continued, sliding a manila envelope across the table. Your contributions won't be forgotten. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Forgotten? They had already erased me, wiped me clean from their pristine office floors. But instead, I smiled, tight-lipped, controlled, and nodded. I gathered my things, placed the envelope in my bag, and walked out of the room with my head held high. If I was going to be discarded, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. The elevator ride down felt interminable, each floor bringing me closer to the reality of what had just happened. My phone buzzed in my bag, and I pulled it out, already knowing who it was. Matt, my husband. He'd been texting all morning about dinner with his parents tonight. I stared at the screen, feeling a wave of exhaustion crash over me. The thought of sitting through another evening with Barbara's subtle digs and Richard's incessant probing about my work made me want to scream. Matt and I had been married for 3 years, and though I loved him, he had never quite understood my drive. He often told me I worked too hard, that I needed to slow down and focus on what really matters, by which he usually meant him and his family. Yet, he never seemed to question how we could afford our sleek downtown apartment or the loans his parents frequently requested. Tonight, I would have to tell him everything, and the thought of his reaction only added to the sinking weight in my chest. When I stepped into the lobby, Amy was waiting. She was holding 2 coffee cups, her face already full of concern. Amy had been my best friend since college, the one person who could read me without me saying a word. How bad? She asked, handing me one of the lattes. Terminated, I said, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. Effective immediately. Budget cuts. Apparently. Amy's eyes narrowed, her protective instincts kicking in. That's ridiculous. You brought in their biggest accounts last quarter. Tell that to Stevens and his budget constraints, I replied, taking a sip of the latte. The scalding heat burned my tongue, but I didn't mind. The pain felt grounding. Almost comforting. Matt's going to love this, I muttered after a moment, trying to sound casual but failing. His mother's been hinting that I work too much anyway. Forget Barbara, Amy said sharply. That woman wouldn't know hard work if it bit her in her designer handbag. I laughed weakly, appreciating her loyalty. But the weight in my chest remained. Amy suggested lunch, a chance to process everything properly. But I shook my head. I can't. Family dinner tonight. I have to figure out how to break the news. Amy's expression darkened. You don't owe them anything, Lauren. Not tonight. I have to go, I insisted, my voice hollow. If I don't, Barbara will never let me hear the end of it. And Matt needs to know. Better to get it over with. She hugged me tightly, and for a moment, I felt like crying. But I didn't. I promised to call her later and walked out into the crisp autumn air. Something cold settled in my stomach as I hailed a ride home, a feeling I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just grief over losing my job. It was something deeper. A whisper of suspicion that had been growing louder in recent weeks. I thought of the strange bank statements I'd found in Matt's office. The way Richard had started asking increasingly detailed questions about my company's financial projections during Sunday brunches. Something wasn't right. And as I rode away from Preston and Clark, the envelope heavy in my bag, I knew I couldn't ignore that feeling any longer. By the time I got home, my phone buzzed again. Matt's voicemail was cheerful, almost oblivious. Hey, babe. Mom's making your favorite tonight. Don't be late. Okay. And wear that blue dress she got you for Christmas. You know how she gets about these things. The cold feeling in my stomach hardened into something sharper. I deleted the message and opened my rideshare app. Instead of heading home to change, I entered the address for the bank. Those strange statements were nagging at me, louder now than ever. If I was going to face Matt and his family tonight, I needed answers first. The car ride to the bank was quiet, save for the faint hum of the engine. I stared out the window, my mind racing. Every instinct told me that something wasn't right, that the timing of my termination wasn't just a coincidence. Budget cuts didn't explain those bank statements, or the way Richard had been digging for information about my retirement accounts. I had spent years mastering my ability to spot inconsistencies in data. How had I missed the ones in my own life? At the bank, the air felt colder, the fluorescent lights too bright. The manager, a middle-aged man with a carefully practiced smile, greeted me with professional politeness. Mrs. Miller, what can I help you with today? I need to check on some accounts, I said, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. I slid my ID across the counter, my hands trembling just enough for him to notice. His expression changed as he pulled up the records, his carefully controlled demeanor faltering for just a second. I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller, but I can't discuss these accounts without your husband's authorization. My heart sank. Accounts? Plural? He hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Private accounts. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had only one account, a joint one Matt and I shared. My mind raced. The cold suspicion in my stomach now sharp and undeniable. Something was very wrong. I left the bank in a daze, the weight of what I'd just learned pressing down on me. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, my phone buzzed again. Another message from Matt. Don't forget the blue dress. Mom's already setting the table. The words felt surreal. How could he go about his day so casually, knowing what he had done? Or maybe he didn't think I'd notice. Maybe he thought I'd never look. That thought was worse, the idea that he believed I was so blind, so trusting, that I wouldn't see the truth even if it was staring me in the face. By the time I arrived at dinner, the cold feeling in my stomach had turned to ice. Barbara greeted me at the door, her smile as polished and artificial as ever. Lauren, darling, you're late. And that's not the dress I bought you. I lost track of time at work. I lied easily. There was no point in telling her the truth. Not yet. She ushered me inside, her pearls glinting under the chandelier light. Richard's in his study, going over investments. You know how he gets. I nodded but said nothing. I knew all too well how Richard got. He had been relentless in his questions about my company, my finances, and my future. And now, with the discovery of those private accounts, his interest in my affairs seemed even more suspicious. The dining room smelled of roast chicken and expensive wine. Barbara fussed over the table settings, adjusting things that were already perfect. I hope you're not too disappointed about that promotion you mentioned, she said, her tone dripping with faux sympathy. I stiffened. What promotion? Oh, she said, her smile tightening. Didn't you tell us about a senior director position? I hadn't. I never discussed work promotions with Barbara. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of her words. How did she know? And why bring it up now? Before I could respond, Richard's voice boomed from the doorway. Lauren. Just the person I wanted to see. He held a stack of papers in one hand, his reading glasses perched on his nose. Got a minute to look at something? Richard. Barbara interjected. Dinner's ready. Won't take long, he said, gesturing for me to follow him. Reluctantly, I walked into his study. The room smelled of cigars and leather, a shrine to his wealth and power. He spread a set of documents across his desk. Have you considered diversifying your portfolio? The market's volatile these days. Smart money's moving into private equity. I stared at the papers, barely listening. I prefer keeping things simple, I said carefully, my voice steady. Matt handles most of our investments. Richard smiled faintly, but his tone was sharp. Ah yes. Matt mentioned you're quite conservative with money. His words hung in the air, loaded with meaning. I studied his face, trying to decipher what he wasn't saying. Before I could respond, Barbara appeared in the doorway. Mark's bringing someone to dinner, she announced, her tone casual but her eyes sharp. Rebecca, the new junior partner. They're working late on that merger. The name Rebecca triggered something in my memory. Matt's phone lighting up late at night. A preview of a text, missing you already. I had dismissed it at the time, trusting him. Now, that trust felt like a distant, naive dream. As I walked back to the dining room, my mind churned. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more sinister than I could have imagined. Something was happening, something bigger than I'd realized, and I was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. Dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression, with Barbara at the helm. The roast chicken was perfectly cooked, the wine perfectly aged, and yet the tension in the air was so thick it could have been sliced like the butter on the table. Rebecca sat next to Matt, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her laughter just a touch too loud. She was everything Barbara adored in a person, poised, polished, and undeniably obedient to the family hierarchy. I, on the other hand, was the outsider who had always worked too hard and dreamed too loudly. Matt kissed my cheek as he sat across from me. His charm dialed up to the maximum. Sorry I'm late, he said casually, placing a hand on Rebecca's shoulder. Big breakthrough with the merger. Rebecca's been invaluable, I don't know what I'd do without her. His words were like a punch to the gut, but I kept my expression neutral. I can imagine, I said, my voice steady as I met his gaze. How long have you two been working together? Oh, months now, Rebecca replied, her voice lilting before Matt could answer. He's mentioned you so often. Lauren. I feel like I already know you. Funny, I replied, forcing a smile. He's never mentioned you. The polite tension crackled beneath the surface as Barbara quickly swooped in, directing everyone to their seats. I noticed she placed Rebecca next to Matt across from me. Subtle, but not subtle enough. As the dinner conversation ebbed and flowed, my mind worked overtime, replaying every moment from the past few weeks, the strange bank statements, the probing questions, the text on Matt's phone, The pieces of the puzzle were coming together. But there was still something missing. Some detail that would tie it all into a clear picture. The wine flowed freely. And as the evening wore on, Richard began pontificating about investments. The market's tricky these days, he said, swirling his glass of Bordeaux. Smart money is moving into private equity. You have to stay ahead of the curve. Is that what you've been doing? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Staying ahead of the curve? Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't respond. Barbara, ever the vigilant hostess, interjected with a tight smile. Lauren, darling, how's work going? You mentioned a promotion recently, senior director. Wasn't it? I set my wine glass down deliberately. Actually, I lost my job today. Budget cuts. Apparently. The room went silent. For a moment. No one knew what to say. Then Barbara tilted her head. Her expression carefully measured. Oh, darling. Perhaps it's for the best. Now you can focus on what really matters. Yes, I said. My voice calm but pointed. What really matters? Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Matt's shoulders relax ever so slightly, as though a weight had been lifted. Rebecca kept her gaze fixed on her plate, and Richard exchanged a quick glance with Barbara. The reactions were subtle, but they spoke volumes. This wasn't just bad luck or coincidence. This was orchestrated. After dinner, Richard pulled me aside again, his demeanor casual but his tone carrying an edge. I wanted to ask you something about your retirement accounts. Have you considered reallocating those funds? I stared at him, my heart pounding. Why are you so interested in my finances? Richard. He blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I'm just trying to help. Family looks out for each other. After all. Family. The word tasted bitter. Was this what family was to them? Schemes. Manipulation. And secrets. I smiled thinly and excused myself. But the cold feeling in my stomach only grew. As the evening came to an end, Matt kissed me on the cheek and whispered, You were amazing tonight. Mom and Dad adore you. You know that. I didn't respond. Instead, I smiled and walked out the front door, my mind already racing with plans. Whatever this was, I would uncover it. They had underestimated me, and that would be their downfall. In the car ride home, I pulled out the termination papers from my bag. My name was there, printed neatly at the top, along with all the corporate jargon that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. But at the bottom, something caught my eye, a signature I didn't recognize. My termination wasn't just approved, it was pushed through by someone outside my department. The cold suspicion crystallized into anger. This wasn't just betrayal. This was war. And if they thought I was going to go down quietly, they were sorely mistaken. I grabbed my phone and dialed Amy. I need you to call Jason, I said when she picked up. Tell him I have some documents I need him to look at. What's going on? Amy asked, her voice filled with concern. I think Matt and his family are hiding something, I said, my voice trembling slightly, and I'm going to find out what it is. The next morning, I sat at Amy's kitchen table, the manila envelope from my termination sitting between us. Jason, her brother, had already spread out a collection of papers across the table. His laptop hummed softly, casting a pale glow on his face as he analyzed the data. Jason was meticulous, his eyes scanning each document like a detective piecing together a crime. This isn't just suspicious, he muttered, circling a set of numbers with his pen. This is deliberate. These transactions are structured to fly under the radar, small enough to avoid red flags but frequent enough to siphon off significant sums over time. I leaned forward, gripping my coffee cup like a lifeline. What does that mean? It means someone has been systematically moving money from your accounts. Jason replied, his tone serious. And these transfers coincide with your paycheck deposits. It's like clockwork. Amy's mouth tightened as she flipped through the papers Jason had already marked. This is insane. And you're saying Matt's involved in this? Jason didn't look up. It's not just Matt. These transfers are tied to an account managed by Richard's investment firm. This isn't a one-man operation, it's a coordinated effort. The room fell silent as his words sank in. I stared at the papers. The numbers blurring as anger and betrayal roared to life inside me. This wasn't just theft. This was calculated, cold, and personal. How do we prove it? I asked finally, my voice trembling but resolute. Jason sat back, his expression thoughtful. You already have proof of the transfers. But you'll need more communications. Evidence of their intent. If we can tie Richard's firm to your termination, it'll be a nail in their coffin. And what about Rebecca? Amy asked, her voice laced with suspicion. She's been glued to Matt's side. Do you think she's involved? I thought about Rebecca's perfectly polished demeanor, her strategic placement at the dinner table, and the way her name had appeared in the text I'd seen on Matt's phone. She's not innocent, I said, my jaw tightening. She's in this up to her neck. Jason nodded. Then it's time to make them show their hand. Underscore 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 underscore. That evening, I attended an impromptu dinner at Richard and Barbara's house. My mind was buzzing with everything Jason had uncovered. But I forced myself to remain calm. I needed to keep playing the role of the dutiful wife and daughter-in-law, at least for now. Barbara greeted me at the door with her usual veneer of politeness. Lauren, how lovely to see you again. I hope you're feeling better after yesterday. Much better, I lied. Stepping inside, my gaze immediately sought out Matt, who was standing in the living room, laughing at something Rebecca had said. She was perched on the arm of the couch, her hand resting on his shoulder in a way that made my stomach churn. Dinner was an excruciating affair, with Barbara leading the conversation as though nothing was wrong. But I noticed the glances Richard exchanged with Matt, the quick smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. They were hiding something. And the tension in the room was palpable. As the evening wound down, Richard cornered me in his study once again. Lauren, you've always been such a smart woman, he began, his tone oozing false sincerity. You understand how important family is, don't you? Of course, I replied, forcing a smile. Good, he said, nodding approvingly, because family comes first. And sometimes, that means making sacrifices for the greater good. I clenched my fists, barely able to contain my anger. Is that what you've been doing? Making sacrifices? Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. We've all had to adjust. These are challenging times. Before he could continue, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I glanced at the screen and saw Amy's name flashing. I excused myself and stepped outside to answer. Lauren, Amy said urgently, Jason found something else. There's a series of emails between Matt and Rebecca discussing your termination. They planned it weeks before it happened. The air rushed out of my lungs. Emails? Yes. And there's more. Jason found documents showing that Richard's firm has been laundering money through offshore accounts. It's all connected. I gripped the phone tightly. This is it. Isn't it? This is the evidence we need. It's enough to blow their entire operation wide open. Amy confirmed. But you need to act fast. If they suspect anything, they'll cover their tracks. I hung up, my mind spinning. The final pieces of the puzzle were in place. And the truth was more damning than I had imagined. They hadn't just betrayed me, they had built an empire on lies and deceit. And now, I was going to bring it all crashing down. The next morning, the weight of what I had learned pressed heavily on me. I wasn't just dealing with a betrayal, I was dealing with a calculated, systematic effort to destroy me. And yet, For the first time in days, I felt a sense of clarity. The pieces were all there, scattered like shards of glass, and it was time to assemble them into something sharp enough to cut through the facade Matt and his family had built. I called Amy and Jason and laid out my plan. It was risky, but we had the evidence. Now, I just needed to deliver the final blow. Jason had already submitted the documents to the SEC anonymously, but public exposure was equally important. If I wanted to make sure Richard, Barbara, and Matt couldn't escape the consequences, I needed to act decisively. That evening, I arrived at Barbara's charity gala. It was her pride and joy, an annual showcase of wealth and influence attended by the city's elite. The venue was as extravagant as ever, all crystal chandeliers and soft jazz echoing through the ballroom. I scanned the room, noting the carefully curated crowd of donors and socialites, all sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. Barbara thrived in this environment, her pearls gleaming under the lights as she floated from guest to guest. Her laughter light and insincere. They hadn't noticed me yet. Good. Amy stood by the bar, pretending to read a program but watching my every move. Jason had done his part, and everything was ready. I smoothed the black dress I'd chosen, one Matt had always hated, ironically enough, and steadied my breath. I had one shot to make this count. Barbara spotted me first. Her smile faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. "Lauren," she said, approaching me with outstretched arms. "How lovely to see you. I didn't realize you'd be joining us tonight." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, my tone deceptively sweet. After all, family traditions matter, don't they? Her eyes flickered, but she quickly recovered. "Of course. Have you had a chance to say hello to Richard? He's been asking about you." "Not yet," I said, scanning the room, "but I'm sure I'll see him soon." Before she could respond, I stepped past her, heading toward the stage. My pulse quickened as I climbed the steps, the noise of the room dimming as the spotlight caught me. A few guests turned to look, their conversations pausing as curiosity flickered across their faces. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me, "I'd like to propose a toast." The room fell silent. All eyes were on me now. From the corner of my eye, I saw Richard and Matt exchange alarmed glances, their expressions tightening. Barbara stood frozen, her hand gripping a champagne flute so tightly her knuckles turned white. "To the Bennett family," I continued, raising my glass, "to their generosity, their success, and their unparalleled commitment to, shall we say, creative financial practices." A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. Matt began pushing his way toward the stage, his face a mask of barely concealed panic. I held my ground, my gaze locking with his as I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. "Allow me to share something with you," I said, projecting my phone screen onto the large display behind me. A recording began to play, Rebecca's voice echoing through the room, crisp and clear. "Once we get control of her assets, she won't have anything left to fight with." Gasps erupted as the crowd began to murmur. The recording ended, but I wasn't finished. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is Rebecca Carlton, discussing how she and Matt orchestrated my termination. But let's not stop there. How about Richard's offshore accounts? Or Barbara's role in covering up a previous victim's financial ruin?" Matt reached the base of the stage, his face pale. "Lauren," he hissed, his voice low, "stop this. You don't know what you're doing." "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, my voice cutting through the room. "I'm doing what you taught me." Matt, turning the tables. I clicked through a series of emails, financial records, and recorded conversations, each one more damning than the last. The room was in chaos now, guests whispering, phones snapping pictures, and some even leaving in disgust. Barbara finally found her voice. "You ungrateful," she began, but I cut her off. Ungrateful? I said, my voice rising. You stole everything from me, my career, my money, my trust, and you thought I'd just roll over and take it. At that moment, federal agents entered the ballroom, moving directly toward Richard and Matt. One agent approached Richard, pulling out a badge. We have some questions about your firm's financial practices. The color drained from Richard's face as he stammered a protest. Matt turned to me, his charm stripped away, replaced by cold fury. You think you've won, he spat. I smiled, stepping down from the stage as the agents surrounded him. This isn't about winning, Matt. It's about justice. As the chaos unfolded behind me, I walked toward the exit, Amy falling into step beside me. How does it feel? She asked quietly. I hesitated, the weight of everything settling over me. Like the beginning, I said. And for the first time in years, I believed it. As I walked away from the chaos of the gala, the crisp night air filled my lungs. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The Bennett's empire of lies had finally crumbled. Exposed for the world to see. Justice had been served not just for me, but for every victim they had exploited along the way. It wasn't a clean victory. The scars they left behind would take time to heal. And I wasn't sure if I'd ever fully forgive myself for the person I had to become to bring them down. But one thing was certain, I wasn't their victim anymore. I was stronger, wiser, and ready to rebuild a life on my own terms. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more powerful tales of resilience, justice, and hope. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.